可以轉做啲咩啊 ？Shadon Nu James Griffiths，我哋請住國語先啦。What did we chat about？ 想知道，我哋馬上去片。
So we are delighted to have James Griffiths with us today, the author of Speak Not, Empire, Identity, and the Politics of Language. Hello, James. Rehanda, Sitahi.
Dwi'n iawn, diolch yn fawr. Dwi yn siarad gyda ti o Ynys Môn, which is where I grew up. So I'm in Anglesey right now, visiting family, but I'm based in Hong Kong. But it's nice to come home every so often. I'm originally from Ynys Môn in North Wales. I grew up in the UK, but I've lived in Greater China since. I've lived in Hong Kong for 10 years, and I was in Shanghai and some other places on the mainland for a couple of years before then. So spent most of my adult life in Asia. I'm a journalist. I used to work at CNN, which is where I wrote my 2 books, and I'm the Asia correspondent for the Globe and Mail, which is a Canadian newspaper. And as well as Speak Not, which you mentioned, I'm also the author of a book called The Great Firewall of China, How to Build and Control an Alternative Version of the Internet, which is about Chinese internet censorship and campaigns of censorship and surveillance around the world.
Perfect. So let's start with talking about the books. You introduce Welsh, Hawaiian, and Cantonese, and discuss how their speakers fight for the language survival against the dominance of official languages. How did you identify these languages and communities?
So it started with Welsh and Cantonese, kind of because I was a Welsh-speaking person living in Hong Kong, and speak some Cantonese. My wife's family speaks Cantonese, and as a reporter and both as someone living in a Cantonese-speaking community, it was very interesting to me that a lot of the conversations that people had about the language, and especially kind of the future of the language, were very reminiscent of those that I remember around Welsh when I was growing up. And I started to kind of dig into that, and why is that? What are the concerns around Cantonese? And it was, there are a lot of parallels between Cantonese and Welsh, and I started to kind of look at other languages, and I wanted, when I started to make this a longer term project, I wrote a long article about it first and then was turning it into a book. I knew I wanted a third language to kind of be able to compare different stages of development, things like that. And I struck on Hawaiian quite early because it's at an interesting stage in its development, kind of compared to Welsh and Cantonese. So it's not exactly the same, but there are similarities in that Hawaii is, a small island community. It's on the edge of this vast empire, in the way that both Wales and Hong Kong are comparatively. And so, there were kind of similarities, but also differences, which made it interesting to discuss the 3 of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your book is meticulously researched, but it also draws on your personal experience, like including yourself as a Welsh speaker. So how do you think this experience shaped the narrative of your book, or the perspective when you see these different languages?
Yeah, so I think it gave me an insight definitely into the concerns that people have around the language, just because I have these concerns around my own native language, and that definitely shapes how I kind of come to this topic. And then also having lived through, kind of unconsciously lived through this Welsh revival, because I'm of the generation that we were kind of really the first generation to benefit from this during our schooling. We were the ones that had full Welsh or bilingual schooling, and that was really the start of the serious revival, is when we started to see the numbers ticking up again. So then, having lived through that, I kind of had a better idea of how those decisions, how political decisions really affect how these languages survive. And I could kind of see, looking at Hong Kong, what Hong Kong lacks, or what Hawaii lacks in terms of protecting the languages and sustaining the language. And then, that helped me how I approached, doing interviews, and how I approached doing the historical research to understand why has Wales developed like this, but say Hawaii, which is, has the same kind of level of democracy and things like that, why has Hawaii not developed like that as well?
What sort of element do you think can motivate people to speak Welsh, like outside of school or just outside of the the institute? Is there any thing you can think of, like we can motivate people to do that?
So one of the things that's changed a lot, I think, since I was a child, and especially as someone that grew up in North Wales, which was always the most Welsh-speaking part of Wales, was while we were definitely a Welsh-speaking community and my schooling was in Welsh, I come from an Anglo background. My parents are English-speaking, and a lot of my friends were English speaking, even though we all spoke Welsh as well. And it just wasn't a very kind of cool thing to speak Welsh. It was seen slightly patronizingly. It was mostly kind of farming communities that spoke it, and there was a bit of snobbery around the fact that people spoke Welsh. And having spoken to young people in Wales now, I think that has shifted quite a lot. That it is quite a cool language. There's a lot of culture in Welsh. S4C did not used to produce cool shows. Like BBC Radio Cymru did not do anything cool when I was growing up, and now they seem to actually be much more kind of in touch with popular culture, because I think you do need both. Education is the most important thing, but there has to be a reason to speak that language once you've learned it, right? There has to be, and it's not just enough. We can't all have conversations about like rulers and whiteboards and how to spell. We need to be able to talk about interesting things, and I think that's where the pop culture really is important. And having this kind of new media that's coming out in Welsh, of both TV shows and YouTube channels, and singers and musicians and stuff, that really helps kind of sustain it and encourage people to use it in a way that is true to their lives, not just true to kind of this educational side of it.
Yeah, I agree. Like we think speaking Welsh is really cool. Kai is learning Welsh, and I like your dad picking it up on Duolingo. It's a kind of really interesting experience, and we sing Yamohi when we watch football in Cardiff.
Yeah.
So it was a great experience. So I'm gonna ask something about Cantonese, another language you've written about. So as a Cantonese speaker, I find it strange to categorize it as a minority language, given that it's also mentioned in your book as well. There's a large number of speakers worldwide. However, I also have this feeling that Cantonese is gradually being marginalized in Hong Kong. Can you elaborate more on why you believe Cantonese is or will become an endangered language?
Yeah, I mean, it's, on the face of it, it is obviously ridiculous to talk about Cantonese in the context of kind of endangered or minority languages, because, this is a language that's spoken by tens of millions of people around the world. And to include it in the book is intentionally to kind of talk about it in a future tense, that this is something that is an endangered language in the kind of very strict sense of the word, as in it is potentially in danger, but it is not, definitely it's not, vulnerable now to we have so many people that speak it. But I do think that Cantonese's kind of position is weaker than it looks on paper, because while you do have tens of millions of people, we only really have one first language community, which is in Hong Kong, a smaller one in Macau, obviously, but Hong Kong is the primary first language Cantonese community. Most of the rest of the speakers are in diaspora communities. And while diaspora communities are incredibly important often for sustaining languages when they are in a vulnerable state, they don't tend to be generators of culture and kind of, first language culture in the same way. And so, just as I was saying about Welsh, that, the fact that we have culture to consume in Welsh is incredibly important. Well, for decades, most of the Cantonese culture that people have consumed around the world has been generated in Hong Kong. It's Hong Kong cinema, it's Hong Kong TV, it's Hong Kong newspapers. And so that means that if Cantonese is vulnerable in Hong Kong, I think it makes it more vulnerable around the world, because Hong Kong is so important to this kind of global Cantonese community. And we've already seen straight across the border in just I mean, barely even 2 generations, a generation and a half across the border, the massive decline of Cantonese speaking due to Chinese language policies. And, you have, quite a lot of, children and families where the younger people will, it always goes in a cycle, right? You have maybe grandparents who only speak Cantonese, you have parents who speak Cantonese and Mandarin, and then you have like kids who speak primarily Mandarin but maybe understand Cantonese. But the problem is, once you hit that generation does not pass on Cantonese to their children. That person who speaks primarily Mandarin but understands Cantonese speaks Mandarin at home with their kids, and then that's the break. It happens so quickly, within a single person's lifetime, and we've already seen that in Guangdong. And I don't think that's about to happen, immediately in Hong Kong. But the concern, I think, is a serious one, because to push back against that kind of language policy that is destructive and is monolingual requires political freedom and political organizing of the type that is extremely difficult, if not impossible, in Hong Kong today. And so I think that makes Hong Kong vulnerable, which, like I said, makes the broader Cantonese community vulnerable. And that's why I think it's important to talk about this. It's important to talk about this as kind of, can we stop Cantonese ever getting to a position where it's vulnerable? If we have the conversations around Cantonese now, does that shore it up and it never gets to a vulnerable stage? And that's why I thought it was important to kind of, compare that to languages that really had to reach a, almost terminal decline before people did the work to sustain them.
I see. So we're going back to something interesting about Welsh. Can you recommend us some Welsh pop culture, like music and drama, or even YouTube channel that some of our audience from Wales or anywhere can start learning or knowing about?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm afraid I'm probably quite old-fashioned and not hip with Welsh, with a lot of kind of real contemporary Welsh culture. But there's a fantastic musician called Gwennar, who sings both in Welsh and in Cornish. Her father is actually hugely instrumental in the Cornish revival, and she does this kind of haunting. I mean, if people know Sigur Rós, her music is quite similar to Sigur Rós, but sung in Welsh and in Cornish, and is fantastic. Mm-hmm. And this isn't particularly kind of Welsh language, but there, as someone who's from North Wales, particularly, there's a TV show called Welcome to Wrexham, which is about the revival of the of Wrexham FC, as owned by Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney, and just got promoted to League One a few days ago, and that's fascinating. I actually interviewed one of the producers on it for a piece I wrote about the Welsh football team a couple of years ago. And that's fascinating to kind of see how this is an American-made TV show about, a relatively English-speaking part of North Wales, like Wrexham's right on the border with England. And yet they made a real effort to kind of highlight and feature Welsh and Welsh culture in a way that I don't think ever would have happened, even 10 years ago. It shows the kind of level of confidence and the level of influence that the Welsh language has now, that even from an outside perspective, it's seen as something important. And I kind of felt like that as well and I can't remember what season it was, but there was a season of The Crown, which depicts Prince, now King Charles, when he was studying in Aberystwyth. And it has whole sections that are purely in Welsh. It has his teacher at home, and they're speaking Welsh in the family, and has Charles learning Welsh. And I think not that long ago, that kind of would have been played for laughs. This idea that he had to speak this, this crazy language that they speak over the border, and yet now it was both played seriously, and it depicted a Welsh-speaking family at home just as if that was completely normal. Because of course they spoke Welsh at home, and you just put subtitles on it, and it's as if it's like any other language. And so that's really come a long way. And then also finally, YouTube, I would recommend, there's a channel called Rhapsody and Lingo, who is Israel. He's a Hong Konger as well, and he is a linguist, and he speaks Welsh. He speaks an absurd number of languages, but it does a lot of these videos around language learning and kind of embracing new cultures, and they're really interesting.
Yeah. So Kai, do you have any other questions? Because this is the end of my my last questions.
Yeah, thanks for both because yeah, it's really informative. And I was just wondering about one thing. So we just mentioned about pop culture. And how about Hong Kong pop culture? Do you have any like sort of favorite TV series or singers or bands that you would recommend?
Again, I'm going to show my age, I think, again, if I start to. So my favorite Hong Kong band is My Little Airport. But I think that really ages me because that really is a millennial band.
No, I like them as well.
Oh well, there we go. Okay, good. And then I mean, pop culture wise, yeah, I have to be honest, I don't consume a ton in Cantonese or watch TV. I mean, we watch. I'm have a very kind of embarrassing admission that I do watch Miss Hong Kong every year. Just because I enjoy the kind of ridiculousness of it, and I'll watch TVB with my in-laws and stuff. But yeah, I don't consume a ton of Hong Kong TV certainly. But yeah, I'm very happy to listen to My Little Airport every day. So.